January 17, 1920. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution goes into effect. The ban on the manufacture, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors is now the law of the land.
Americans really believed that once you banned alcohol, crime would vanish.
You can see through the 1920s how miserably that failed.
Gangsters emerge from the shadows and take center stage.
Prohibition created the opportunity for the flourishing of organized crime.
It's hard to even call it a netherworld because it was so open.
Violence escalates.
And they line these guys up against the wall, shoot them all dead.
A new president marshals the power of the state against the nation's most famous outlaw.
Herbert Hoover despised Capone.
And every day he says, get Capone, get Capone.
It's an epic battle that reshapes law enforcement.
The federal role in crime prevention barely existed before Prohibition.
The federal government begins to shift from providing infrastructure and starting to tell you how to behave.
You have just a massive expansion of enforcement officials.
Its effects ripple forward to this day.
It shapes a lot of the rest of the 20th century.
It's a dress rehearsal for the much larger, much longer war on drugs that was initiated in the 1970s.
Prohibition looms in our mind to this day. It split us. It has changed us.
"5 years into Prohibition, and America is transformed. But one thing the Roaring '20s isn't is sober.
It's an extraordinary period in which one set of Americans is trying to reinforce sobriety and moral rectitude, and other Americans are blatantly ignoring them and doing what they want to do anyway.
Prohibition did not outlaw the consumption of alcohol. It outlawed the manufacture, the transportation, import, export, and sale of alcohol. But the consumption of alcohol itself was not illegal during Prohibition.
There was a belief among many of the prohibitionists that if you got rid of alcohol, then we would become paradise on earth and would solve any number of social problems. Problems in the home, men beating their wives, people not showing up for work or showing up.
Interesting opportunity for entrepreneurial business folks.
To capitalize on demand, American inventors come up with ways to hide booze. From boots that can hold a flask, to life jackets that can be filled with liquor. Prohibition even spurs innovation in the fledgling automotive industry.
Cars were riding very, very low because the weight of alcohol was substantial. The springs couldn't handle it. So some of the motor companies, and particularly Packard and Buick, they became known for their powerful, strong springs that they put under it so that the car wouldn't sag and the alcohol was hidden.
That same entrepreneurial spirit can be found at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History in their collection of Prohibition-era cocktail paraphernalia.
There's actually, by my count, no fewer than 35, 36 at least patents covering cocktail shakers or some components thereof during Prohibition. We have two cocktail shakers used by families living in Maryland during Prohibition.
They weren't used for making lemonade.
Yeah, this is a really, really fun shaker. This was marketed as the Tells You How beverage mixer.
The rotating chamber reveals ingredients for 15 different cocktails. They are the ones supplying the liquor.
As soon as the nation decided that it was illegal to sell alcohol, we created the opportunity for a gigantic industry.
Like the mixers in the Southside Fizz, the flappers and hot jazz of the Prohibition era mask a bitter reality.
One of the reasons we romanticize Prohibition often is because we're thinking about that world of subterranean, adventurous nightlife leisure.
Despite the nearly 300 lynchings committed by the Ku Klux Klan during the 1920s, the Dries remain a robust bipartisan force. Women's groups, together with wealthy industrialists like John D. Rockefeller, remain firmly in favor of prohibition. Then, in 1929, an act of violence turns the eyes of the nation to Chicago and shakes this coalition to its core. February 14th, 1929. St. Valentine's Day. 7 men, associates of the notorious North Side Gang, are lured to a parking garage on the city's south side. February 14th, 1929. St. Valentine's Day. 7 men, associates of the notorious North Side Gang, are lured to a parking garage on the city's south side.
A couple cars roll up. Some guys get out. They look like police. And they line these guys up against the wall. Shoot them all dead.
Chicago police quickly work their way through the usual suspects. And suspect number 1 is Al Capone.
Just became sort of like by a force of nature, by gravity, by Capone being the biggest object in the universe, people began to assume that Capone must have had something to do with it.
And talk about, Al Capone did this. Al Capone charged with that. Al Capone suspected of. That was very common.
What isn't common? Its impact on the public imagination.
The tabloid press is new in the 1920s, and it is flogging stories to make profits.
Newspapers were publishing more grisly photos than they'd ever published before. And that was really a factor. People saw these pictures from the Valentine's Day Massacre. It was horrifying.
Closing the case becomes priority number 1 for Chicago police. But their investigation is hindered from the start.
You only had one living witness, and he only lived for a few minutes. And you had no other witnesses. You had nothing but theories, and you had a police department that was not particularly well known for solving murders.
The investigation in Chicago quickly grinds to a halt. Then, on March 4th, 1929, just 2 weeks after the massacre, a new president is sworn into office.
Herbert Hoover was an engineer. He was a law and order man, very much process-oriented. And he was very upset that the court systems, the justice systems were falling apart. He wanted to fix it. And he saw the Valentine's Day Massacre and saw Chicago as a symptom of the problem.
Hoover argued that we needed to reform the entire apparatus of the criminal justice system because it was failing. This was in his inaugural address, one of his #1 priorities, and launched really the first war on crime.
I propose to appoint a national commission for a searching investigation of the whole structure of our federal system of jurisprudence, to include the method of enforcement of the 18th Amendment and the causes of abuse under it.
The notion of identifying crime, ordinary crime, lawlessness as a real threat, a menace to the nation, was something really new.
For Hoover, Capone and his suspected involvement in the massacre represents the lawlessness infecting the country. The new president is determined to pit the full power of the federal government against prohibition violators. Step 1, reform the existing enforcement mechanism, the Volstead Act, and rid the law of its exceptions and loopholes.
Congress passes the Jones Law, which radically increases the penalties for violating the Volstead Act, for violating the prohibition laws.
And if you know that someone is violating the Volstead Act, and we can prove that you knew and turned your head, then we're going to charge you with a crime.
and even more fun to plan a vacation around.
One of the favorite destinations of Americans looking to escape Prohibition was Havana, Cuba.
It's called the Paris of the Caribbean, and the rich flock to its thriving nightclub scene, along with gangsters like Al Capone. The sudden influx occurred.
So the legend has it that it was created at the Hotel Nacional de Cuba for silent film actress Mary Pickford. It's got rum in it, it's got pineapple juice, it's got maraschino liqueur, and some people add just a little bit of grenadine. I won't debate what is the proper 100% recipe, but I will tell you that I like it with just maraschino.
But Hoover is battling against a rising tide of violence that cannot be contained.
In the late years of the 1920s, more and more money was at stake, and rival mobs in various cities began to fight more and more intensely over turf. And every time there was another report of mob activity and mob murders, that was another blow to the prohibitionists.
Wealthy Americans have been some of Prohibition's staunchest supporters, but a few start to break rank. One of the first notable defectors is a wealthy socialite named Pauline Sabin.
Pauline Sabin is a very wealthy woman who had previously supported Prohibition, but comes in the second half of the 1920s to oppose it.
She sees that her sons have no respect for law. They're making jokes about Prohibition. She sees all of her friends having parties where the liquor is out in the open, and she realizes this is a bad thing. We have to get rid of it.
Pauline Sabin begins a very active organization of women to oppose Prohibition. Previously, being a wet, especially a public vocal wet, often had some negative connotations. But once Pauline Sabin gets going, opposing Prohibition is a respectable thing to do. And it stands on equally moral ground as supporting Prohibition.
The million women whom I represent come from every walk of life.
Sabin's Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform leverages its growing popularity to great political effect. When the District of Columbia tries to pass a new enforcement bill in 1930, its members descend on Congress. Women opposing the bill outnumber the men in the room 4-1.
Women have the vote now, therefore their voices are quite loud, and they really start to outshout the dry movement.
The wet movement and Hoover's war on crime are both gaining ground. But the gangsters will soon change the rules of the game with the launch of the first national crime syndicate. Prohibition has created a whole new black market industry and turned small-time crooks into multi-millionaires. But in the wake of the St. Valentine's Day massacre, they decide to reevaluate their business model. It's time for crime to get organized. Prohibition has created a whole new black market industry and turned small-time crooks into multi-millionaires. But in the wake of the St. Valentine's Day massacre, they decide to reevaluate their business model. It's time for crime to get organized.
They recognized that, competition's a healthy thing, but competition with guns is not so smart. And maybe what we need to do is figure out, how do we do this and avoid killing one another? How do we do this without stepping on each other's toes?
Nelson Johnson is the author of Boardwalk Empire, the inspiration for the hit TV series about Prohibition-era Atlantic City.
The political leader at the time was a gentleman by the name of Enoch Nucky Johnson, no relation. Nucky was wired into politics both at the state and federal level, and he had enough income from illegal sale of alcohol and booze, broads, and gambling that he bought off the people that he had to buy off.
Nucky Johnson and Lucky Luciano hit on a plan. An invitation-only national conference for gangsters. May 1929. Gangsters from all over the country arrive in Atlantic City for a 4-day convention. From the Masseria family of Manhattan to the Balistreri gang of Kansas City. And Capone, representing Chicago.
They weren't your typical conventioneers, obviously. But from all reports, the 4 days were pretty placid, and they got a lot accomplished. What came out of the convention was a new beast that law enforcement had never seen before. It was crime that was organized on a regional basis, but those regions themselves were interlocked, and so you now had a national crime syndicate.
But they still have one issue to contend with. They all feel the heat from President Hoover's war on crime. To get the cops off their back, they decide to offer up a sacrificial lamb. And they know just who to choose. Al Capone. The deal? He'll cop a plea to gun possession charges and do a year in Philadelphia's Eastern State Pen. It isn't much of a sacrifice. The feds are not appeased. But Herbert Hoover's administration is about to confront another challenge that's even bigger than organized crime. Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. The Roaring Twenties come crashing to a halt. The stock market bottoms out, losing $14 billion in a single day. A new era begins. The Great Depression. And yet the Smithsonian's Political History Collection reveals that Prohibition's most zealous supporters seem blind to people's suffering.
This is a fan distributed by the Women's Christian Temperance Union in 1930, and it holds statistics about the victories of Prohibition. And they're bragging that there are no more hungry, shoeless children, there are no more sad-faced women. We know that life is worse for hungry, shoeless children in 1930 than it was in 1920.
And in Washington, D.C., President Hoover chooses to stay the course.
Be patient, be helpful, recognize the complexity and the difficulty of the problem before.
The Depression was spiraling out of control, and Hoover kept saying it was no big deal, things were going to pass.
Hoover needs a win, and he just might get one. It's been 10 months since the St. Valentine's Day massacre shocked the nation, and it's still unsolved. Things match, but that alone isn't enough to prove Capone gave the order. Try as...
To this day, the Valentine's Day massacre remains an unsolved crime.
After 9 months in jail, Capone walks. President Hoover remains determined to take him down. Some experts see his hands-on fixation with Capone standing in marked contrast to his hands-off approach to the collapsing economy.
Every day he meets with his cabinet, and every day he says, what are we doing about Capone? When are we going to get Capone? Get Capone, he says over and over. Get Capone.
Meanwhile, by the fall of 1930, unemployment is approaching 9%. Hoover is determined to let the private sector take the lead on economic recovery.
He kept saying it's going to pass, don't worry, just buckle up and, we'll get through this together. And people began to blame Hoover personally for this. An empty pocket was called a Hoover flag. The shanty towns were called Hoovervilles. And Hoover became a really despised figure at the time.
His memoir reveals how single-minded he became in his pursuit of Capone.
I directed that all the federal agencies concentrate upon Mr. Capone and his allies.
While President Hoover has his eyes on Capone, there are criminals in his own backyard, and the official bootlegger of Capitol Hill is about to reveal it all. By 1930, unemployment is surging as the Great Depression takes hold. But Prohibition is still making front-page news. Right before the 1930 midterm elections, the Washington Post publishes a series of stories about a bootlegger who sold liquor on Capitol Hill. The article calls him the man in the green hat. By 1930, unemployment is surging as the Great Depression takes hold. But Prohibition is still making front-page news. Right before the 1930 midterm elections, the Washington Post publishes a series of stories about a bootlegger who sold liquor on Capitol Hill. The article calls him the man in the green hat. It relates how his first two customers were Southern congressmen who had both voted for Prohibition. The article's author, none other than the man in the green hat himself, bootlegger George Cassidy. DC historian Garrett Peck knows the Washington Post stories well.
Hey, Fred, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Garrett.
But this is his first chance to hear a nearly first-hand account from George Cassidy's son, Fred.
So how did your dad become a bootlegger for Congress?
During World War I, unfortunately, he suffered a debilitating illness from mustard gas.
Oof.
And when he came back to D.C., you know, he needed to support his family. One of his friends suggested, hey, George, why don't you go down to Congress and sell those guys booze? It sounded like a good idea.
It does sound like a crazy idea, but it worked, though, didn't it?
It did.
So this was like 1920 or so, right, when Prohibition started?
Yeah. One senator would send him a note saying, I need more reading material. And then later, when no one was around, my dad would go up to his office and place the liquor behind a couple of books in his library. And that was his reading material.
George has his own book, a record of all his transactions with the country's top politicians. His business does very well, until February of 1930.
Well, he got arrested, but the black book that he had held had been confiscated by the police. And I guess it must have been that the names that were on that were so important, they felt that maybe it's better if we drop this case and not make a big deal out of it, because Dad never spent a night in jail.
According to Cassidy's Black Book, 4 out of 5 lawmakers routinely violated Prohibition laws. Powerful friends to help keep a bootlegger out of jail. But the hypocrisy of America's political class isn't confined to Capitol Hill.
In Washington, D.C., you have a bartender named Henry William Thomas. Bartenders had to disguise what they were doing. And Henry William Thomas got a job as a quote-unquote soda jerk at the Chevy Chase Country Club. Now, I'm not at all confused about what really happened. Chevy Chase Club was one of the wealthiest group of men in Washington, D.C. They didn't hire him as a soda jerk. He created lots of interesting cocktails, but one of the ones that I really love is called the Hong Kong. And the Hong Kong already exists as a cocktail. It's with gin, but his version isn't anything like that. It's with scotch, sweet vermouth, dry vermouth, and a little bit of maraschino liqueur.
The government can't stop the flow of booze, even to itself. Organized crime thrives on the hypocrisy. Behind the headlines, the Prohibition Bureau is trying to find some way to do what the president asks. Get Capone. But after years of effort and millions of gallons of confiscated alcohol, the Bureau is no closer to a conviction.
The problem with the Prohibition charges was that you couldn't tie them directly to Capone. You couldn't say that he was selling the booze because you didn't catch him doing it, and there was no paperwork to show that he was selling booze.
The government's most promising lead emerges from an unlikely source, the IRS.
In truth, it was accountants working, late at night in offices with weary eyes and trying to find any kind of evidence that would prove that Capone was involved in illegal activities.
Their plan is to take advantage of a 1927 Supreme Court decision. All income, legitimate or otherwise, must be declared and appropriate taxes paid. Finally, here's a way to get Capone. The man to do it is IRS investigator Frank Wilson.
Frank Wilson was one of the unheralded heroes of the Capone investigation. He didn't get any credit for his work, didn't seem to want any credit for his work. He was a guy who wanted to be a police officer but had bad eyesight, ended up becoming an investigator instead.
Wilson immerses himself in the muddy world of Al Capone's business empire, looking for evidence of ill-gotten gains. But despite the almost corporate scale of Capone's operations, the gangster leaves almost no paper trail.
It's very difficult to prove that someone's not earning money. If there's no paperwork, there's no receipts, there's no way to actually show how much he was earning and how much he wasn't paying on.
The seemingly mild-mannered federal agent is undaunted. He strong-arms known associates of Capone.
Getting someone to turn on Capone was not easy because it was dangerous. You know, you were risking your life. But Frank Wilson was able to find people who did business with Capone and then find people who worked for Capone, taking care of the books, and was able to lean on them, basically, to say, you know, we won't come after you if you help us.
3 of Capone's associates turned state's evidence. On October 17, 1931, Al Capone is convicted of income tax evasion in federal court. President Hoover gets Capone, and Capone gets 10 to 12. Capone's reign as a kingpin is officially over. But the takedown of Capone barely puts a dent in the level of gang violence. Even as the moral certainties of Prohibition are increasingly eclipsed by its failings, the continuing expansion of federal power sets a precedent. It does not go unnoticed.
Immigrant working class men and women argued if the federal government is strong enough to pass the 18th Amendment and to enforce Prohibition, why can't the federal government institute a 30-hour week?
These new possibilities frighten those in power.
Elite men and women saw Prohibition as opening a crack in the door toward other forms of federal government expansion. They were concerned that if you could outlaw the liquor industry, perhaps you could outlaw other industries. Perhaps you could regulate the economy in different ways.
June 6, 1932, a bombshell drops. The New York Times calls it the most dramatic single event bearing on the liquor question since the adoption of Prohibition. John D. Rockefeller Jr., one of Prohibition's most ardent advocates, goes public with his support for repeal.
When somebody as prominent as Rockefeller, and prominently, famously dry as Rockefeller, makes such a statement, it was yet another thing that made it impossible for Prohibition to continue.
It's not just the drunk at the end of the bar who's ranting about Prohibition. It's the wealthiest families in America.
That same year, 1932, Hoover is up for re-election. He remains fully committed to Prohibition enforcement, convinced that it remains a bipartisan cause.
Very cagey on the Prohibition issue. He doesn't want it to get in the way of his political career, and he doesn't make much of a big deal about it. And his wife, Eleanor, was very much a dry. She really hated alcohol. She particularly hated the way that Franklin drank his martinis every night, which he did throughout Prohibition, as most American politicians seem to have done.
But Roosevelt recognizes what Hoover hasn't, that ending Prohibition has become a savvy political move.
Prohibition repeal provided an easy way to respond to some of those grievances of these working class ethnic men and women without engaging in new public spending, without reforms such as unemployment insurance. So it was an early way of trying to respond to some of the crisis of the Great Depression without undermining a balanced budget.
And the economic arguments for repeal are compelling.
The government can't function unless it has another source of revenue. and it's pretty obvious. Where can we get that revenue? Aha. Bring back the tax on alcoholic beverages, legalize alcoholic beverages, and the government can function again.
For more than a decade, Prohibition has been supported by both parties. Now, FDR makes it a wedge issue.
This convention wants repeal.
Once the Democratic Party becomes aligned with getting rid of Prohibition, once it's not a bipartisan cause,
Your candidate wants repeal.
further enforces this idea that the Democratic Party is the friend of the working man, the friend of the average person, and so they push hard to get rid of Prohibition, and they build that coalition moving forward.
And I am confident that the United States of America wants repeal.
But there's a problem. No constitutional amendment has ever been repealed.
This is a mug celebrating the victory of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal and the end of Prohibition. And going along with that, even more celebratory, is a shot glass with the slogan, "Happy days are here again." The Democrats are seen as having brought down Prohibition, and so you drink a shot in support of the donkey there.
For the first intangible culture, so Prohibition threatened the existence of one of our contributions to the world.
But the end of Prohibition didn't wipe away the threat it posed to individual liberties. The government would continue to keep its thumb in everybody's drink.
I think that the greatest irony of Prohibition is that it became harder to get a drink after Prohibition than it was during Prohibition, where you had rules about closing hours and whether you could be near a church or whether you could be near a school and what age and so on and so forth.
Prohibition fundamentally altered the relationship between citizens and the federal government. It was the nursery for many kind of entrenched habits of the federal government to intervene in the lives of Americans. Once you had the outlawing of one illicit recreational substance, it was logical to take a penal and punitive approach toward other narcotic drugs that were considered even more dangerous than alcohol and that were more closely associated with poor and minority users.
Historians today talk about the rise of the penal state, how Prohibition is the point where the federal government begins to shift and to lecture to its citizenry how they should behave.
It's not just a kind of one-off weird story of the past. It really helps tell a lot of American history.
It's a story that we think we all know, but in reality, as we look at it, it's clear that it's much more complicated, much more nuanced, and full of unintended consequences.
Prohibition enabled the expansion of organized crime and created a precedent for the legislation of morality, setting the stage for both the war on drugs and the rise of mass incarceration. The noble experiment was a failure. Nonetheless, remarkably consequential. It shaped the course of the 20th century in America, and its impact reverberates to this day.